She wasn't supposed to see them. Lillian Brooks stood frozen in the doorway of the pack house, still wearing the silver dress she'd chosen for her own bonding ceremony, 3 days early, holding the ring Grayson had proposed with, watching her alpha mate kiss her best friend against the wall of his study like she was already dead to him. But here's what nobody in Silver Hollow Pack knew, what Grayson didn't know, what Jenna didn't know. Lillian wasn't just the quiet mate who smiled at galas and stayed out of pack business. For 6 years, she had been the one thing standing between Silver Hollow and total collapse, the encrypted ledgers, the secret alliances, the early warnings that stopped 3 wars before they started. All of it lived in her mind. None of it lived on paper. None of it could be stolen. So when she heard Grayson whisper to Jenna that he planned to reject her publicly, humiliate her in front of the whole pack so his hands would be clean, Lillian didn't scream. She didn't cry, she didn't even let the glass in her hand shatter. She smiled. Because in that moment, Lillian Brooks made a decision that would bring an empire to its knees. By morning, she was gone. No note, no goodbye, no trace. And somewhere hundreds of miles north, a storm was already gathering, one that would wash a dying king into her hands and drag her straight back into the war she thought she'd left behind. This is the story of the woman they underestimated. Stay to the end, because what she becomes will make you want to stand up and cheer. Chapter 1. Silver Hollow Pack sat nestled in the hills like something out of a postcard, stone lodges, silver-tipped pines, wolves who'd sworn generations of loyalty to the Reed bloodline. And in 3 days, Lillian Brooks would finally become their Luna. She'd waited 6 years for this. Not for the title, for the acknowledgement. Nobody in the pack truly understood what Lillian did behind closed doors. To them she was soft-spoken, sweet, always 2 steps behind Alpha Grayson Reed at every gathering, nodding, smiling, refilling drinks. What they didn't know was that every trade agreement Silver Hollow had signed in the last 6 years, every alliance that kept rival packs from testing their borders, every warning that let them evacuate before a wildfire tore through the Eastern Territory. All of it traced back to Lillian's desk, her intuition, her sleepless nights buried in ledgers and encrypted correspondence, while Grayson took the credit at the podium. She didn't mind, or she told herself she didn't. Her best friend, Jenna Parker, was the one person who knew the truth, the real architecture behind Silver Hollow's golden age. Jenna had grown up beside Lillian, had cried with her through every hard season, had promised to stand beside her at the altar in 3 days as her maid of honor. So when Lillian walked into Grayson's private study that evening, dress in hand, ready to surprise him with the final fitting, she wasn't prepared for what she found. Grayson had Jenna pinned gently against the bookshelf, his mouth on hers, his hands in her golden hair like he'd done it 100 times before. And from the ease of it, the familiarity, Lillian understood immediately this wasn't the first time. She should have made a sound. She should have dropped the dress, screamed, thrown something. Instead, her body went very still, the way it always did when she was calculating a threat. "We just need 3 more days," Grayson was murmuring against Jenna's lips. "Once the alliance with the Ashford pack is signed, I don't need her name attached to it anymore. I'll reject her in front of everyone, public, clean. She'll be too humiliated to make a scene and no one will question it." Jenna laughed softly. "And if she does make a scene, she won't." Grayson sounded so certain. "Lillian doesn't fight. She never has." Lillian's fingers tightened around the garment bag until her knuckles went white. "He doesn't fight." As if 6 years of quietly holding an entire pack together with her bare hands was somehow the same as weakness. As if loyalty without recognition was the same as submission. She backed out of the doorway without a sound, her heart hammering so loud she was sure they'd hear it. She made it to the hallway, to the stairs, to her room, before she allowed herself to breathe. There was no dramatic confrontation in her that night. No tears that anyone saw. Just a woman sitting on the edge of her bed, staring at an engagement ring that suddenly felt like a leash, running calculations she'd run 100 times before for the pack's survival. Except this time, The variable was her own life. By midnight, she had a plan. By 3 a.m., she had erased every trace of her digital fingerprint from Silver Hollow's systems. Encrypted files moved, backups scrubbed, passwords changed to locks only she held the key to. Every alliance she'd personally brokered had a silent clause, her signature required for renewal. Every early warning system she'd built for the Pack's borders required her authentication to stay active. She wasn't being cruel. She told herself that, over and over. She was simply taking back what had only ever been hers. At dawn, dressed in plain travel clothes with a single bag over her shoulder, Lillian Brooks walked out of Silver Hollow Pack without looking back once. She didn't leave a note. She didn't need to. The silence itself would say everything. By the time Grayson woke to find her side of the bed cold and untouched, 3 of his most senior advisors were already calling panicked, because overnight, half the Pack's early warning defense grid had gone dark, and nobody could explain why. He wouldn't understand what he'd truly lost for weeks, maybe longer. Somewhere on a bus heading north, watching the hills of Silver Hollow shrink in the rearview window, Lillian allowed herself, for the first time in years, to cry not from heartbreak, but from the terrifying, exhilarating weight of freedom. She had no idea yet that fate was already rearranging itself in the mountains ahead, preparing to hand her a dying king, a war she hadn't chosen, and a second chance at a kind of love she never believed she deserved. But that story was still 3 months away. For now, she just needed to disappear. Chapter 2. 3 months later, in a settlement so remote the nearest town didn't appear on most maps, a woman known only as Lily had become something of a local legend. She'd arrived with almost nothing. 1 bag, cash, and a set of medical skills so precise the settlement healer, an aging widower named Josiah Hale, took one look at her stitching a hunter's wound and offered her his entire practice on the spot. "Where'd a woman like you learn to work like that?" Josiah asked her once, watching her set a broken bone with hands that didn't shake. "Somewhere I don't talk about," Lillian said simply, and something in her tone told him not to ask again. She'd built a small life, a cabin near the tree line, a garden that fought valiantly against the mountain frost, a reputation for competence that meant no one looked too closely at her past. The settlement, mostly rogue wolves and a handful of humans who'd made peace with Pack territory boundaries, didn't ask questions, and Lillian didn't offer answers. What she didn't tell anyone, what she'd barely admitted to herself, was that she still checked Pack news networks late at night, scrolling for any word from Silver Hollow, and what she found made her chest tighten every single time. Alliances dissolving, border skirmishes increasing, a trade dispute with the Ashford Pack that had nearly turned violent. Whispers online, in wolf forums Grayson would never think to monitor, that Silver Hollow's once untouchable defense network had gone eerily quiet, leaving them vulnerable in ways rival packs were already circling to exploit. "It's not my problem anymore," she told herself, closing the laptop every single night. "I don't owe them anything." And yet, there was also this, a comic relief in her own small world, in the form of Otto Reyes, the settlement's chronically over-caffeinated postal courier and self-appointed town gossip, who showed up at her clinic at least twice a week with some outlandish complaint. A splinter, he insisted, was basically a war wound. A raccoon bite he swore came from an unusually aggressive and possibly rabid forest demon. "Lily, I'm telling you, that thing had EYES. Otto insisted one afternoon, holding out his bandaged hand for inspection. Like judgmental eyes, it knew what it was doing. "It's a raccoon, Otto. A demon raccoon." Despite herself, despite everything, Lillian laughed a real laugh, the kind she hadn't let herself have in months. Otto had a talent for that, for cutting through even her darkest days with sheer, ridiculous sincerity. He'd become, without either of them quite noticing, one of the only people who made this new life feel less like hiding and more like living. But peace, as Lillian had learned the hard way, never lasted long. 3 weeks after the raccoon incident, the sky over the mountains turned the color of a bruise, and the worst storm the settlement had seen in a decade rolled in without warning. Lightning split the ridgeline. Rain came down in sheets so thick visibility dropped to almost nothing. Josiah, wisely, told everyone to stay inside and wait it out. Lillian almost did. But some old instinct she couldn't name, the same instinct that had once made her the best crisis manager Silver Hollow ever had, pulled her toward the ravine trail at the edge of the settlement, flashlight in hand, rain plastering her hair to her face. She told herself she was checking the water levels. She told herself a lot of things. What she found at the bottom of that ravine, half submerged in rushing floodwater, blood mixing with rain, was a man built like a mountain himself, dark hair soaked black, a chest carved with old scars and one very fresh, very deep wound along his ribs, unconscious and slipping toward hypothermia with every passing second. She didn't know yet that this was Alpha King Adrian Wolf, ruler of every northern pack territory, a man with enemies numerous enough to fill a war room. All she knew in that moment was that a man was dying in front of her, and every instinct she had, the healer, the strategist, the woman who had once held an entire pack together in silence, screamed at her to move. She got him out of the water with strength that surprised even her. She got him to her cabin through rain and mud and screaming wind, half dragging, half carrying a man twice her size, muscles burning, breath tearing out of her in ragged gasps. By the time she got him onto her table and started working, cleaning the wound, stopping the bleeding, forcing warmth back into a body that had nearly given up, dawn was breaking gray and exhausted over the mountains. He opened his eyes just once, briefly, blearily, as she pressed a cloth hard against his ribs. "Who?" he managed, voice a broken rasp. "Don't talk," Lillian said firmly, the way she'd said to 100 injured wolves before him. "Just breathe." His eyes, gold-flecked and startlingly sharp even through the pain, held hers for one long moment before he lost consciousness again. Lillian sat back on her heels, hands shaking now that the adrenaline was fading, staring down at the stranger she'd just saved. She had no idea that she was looking at the most powerful alpha in the north. She had no idea that his enemies were already searching the mountains for him. And she had absolutely no idea that saving his life was about to unravel every secret she'd worked 3 months to bury. Outside, the storm was finally breaking. Inside her cabin, an entirely different kind of storm was just beginning. Chapter 3. Adrian Wolf woke up in a cabin that smelled like herbs and rain, with a stranger's stitches holding his ribs together, and absolutely no memory of how he'd survived the night. "You're awake," said a voice from across the room, calm, low, entirely unbothered by the fact that she was sitting across from a man who, judging by the sheer amount of muscle and old battle scarring on display, was clearly not just some lost hiker. Adrian's guard instincts flared instantly, even weak as he was. "Where am I?" "My cabin. You fell into the ravine during the storm. You're lucky I found you when I did. Another hour and hypothermia would have finished what the fall started." He studied her, the calm hands, the precise stitching he could feel along his ribs, the way she moved around the small kitchen with an economy of motion that spoke of either extensive medical training or extensive combat training. Possibly both. "You a doctor?" "Something like that." Lillian set a mug of something warm and herbal in front of him, not quite meeting his eyes. "You want to tell me why the most guarded man I've ever stitched up was lying in a ravine with claw marks that didn't come from any animal I recognize?" Adrian's jaw tightened. So she'd noticed. Smart. Dangerously smart, actually, for someone claiming to be a small-town healer. "Business dispute," he said carefully. "Try again." Something flickered in his gold eyes, surprise maybe, or the beginning of respect. "You always this direct with patients who could kill you with one hand." "You're not going to kill me. You can barely lift that mug." Lillian nodded at his shaking grip on the tea. "And I didn't drag 200 and something pounds of stubborn muscle out of a flood just to have you lie to me in my own kitchen." Despite the pain radiating through his entire body, Adrian felt something almost like a laugh crack through his chest. He hadn't been spoken to like that, plainly, without fear, without the careful deference every wolf in his territory used around him, in longer than he could remember. "Adrian," he offered finally. "Adrian Wolf." Something crossed Lillian's face, quick, contained, gone before he could name it. She knew that name. Of course she knew that name. Every pack in 3 territories knew the name Adrian Wolf, Alpha King of the North, the man who'd unified 6 warring packs under one banner through sheer strategic brilliance and, according to rumor, a will made of iron. "Lily," she said simply, offering nothing more. He noticed the omission immediately, filed it away. A man who'd survived as many assassination attempts as he had learned early to notice what people didn't say. Over the next several days, as Adrian's body slowly knit itself back together under Lillian's exacting care, something unexpected began to grow between them. Not the careful, political courtship he was used to, full of calculated compliments and strategic alliances disguised as romance, but something startlingly, almost uncomfortably real. She didn't fawn over him. She argued with him about proper wound care when he tried to push himself too hard, too fast. She made him laugh, actually laugh, a rusty, unfamiliar sound with dry observations about Otto's ongoing war with what he now firmly believed was a supernatural raccoon. "There is no such thing as a demon raccoon," Adrian said one evening, incredulous, as Otto's latest theory was relayed to him. "Tell that to Otto's hand," Lillian said, deadpan, and Adrian laughed so hard his ribs protested, and Lillian had to threaten him with a very unpleasant follow-up injection to make him stop. It was easy, terrifyingly easy, and for a man who'd spent his entire adult life surrounded by wolves who wanted something from him, power, protection, position, the woman patching his wounds and mocking his stubbornness with zero interest in his crown was the most disarming thing he'd encountered in years. But peace again did not last. On the 5th night, Adrian's second-in-command, a sharp-eyed enforcer named Cassius Vane, finally tracked his location and arrived at the settlement with grim news. The attack in the ravine hadn't been random. It had been an assassination attempt, orchestrated by someone inside Adrian's own inner circle, someone with access to his private travel routes. "They're still out there," Cassius warned, glancing warily at Lillian. "And now they'll know he survived. They'll come looking. Sir, we need to move you somewhere secure immediately." Adrian looked at Lillian across the cabin, something unreadable in his expression. Leaving meant safety. It also meant leaving the first person in years who'd looked at him and seen a man instead of a crown. "Give us the night," Adrian said quietly. "We leave at dawn." Cassius reluctantly agreed. That night, standing on the small porch of her cabin under a sky finally clear of storms, Adrian turned to Lillian with a directness that startled her. "Come with me, Adrian. I'm not asking as a king." His voice was low, rough, entirely stripped of the practiced authority she'd noticed him wielding with Cassius. "I'm asking as a man who hasn't felt like himself in years, until a stranger dragged him out of a ravine and told him to stop being an idiot about his own stitches." Lillian's throat tightened. Every instinct she'd spent 3 months burying, the strategist, the woman who used to run calculations for an entire pack's survival, was screaming at her that this was dangerous, that getting entangled with another alpha, another crown, another set of enemies, was exactly the kind of chaos she'd run from in the first place. But some other part of her, quieter and far more honest, was tired of running. "I need time," she said finally, "not to think about you, to think about what I'd be walking back into." Something in Adrian's face softened with understanding he clearly didn't fully grasp yet, because he had no idea what walking back into truly meant for her, no idea about Silver Hollow or Grayson, or the empire she'd once quietly held together with her bare hands. He didn't push. He simply nodded, reached out, and, with a gentleness that startled them both, brushed a strand of rain-damp hair from her face. "Then I'll wait," he said. "I've waited for worse things with far less reason." Neither of them noticed the pair of eyes watching from the tree line beyond the cabin, a scout, sent not by Adrian's assassins, but by someone else entirely. Someone from Silver Hollow. Someone who had finally, after 3 agonizing months, found Lillian Brooks. And when he arrived the following morning, everything Lillian had built here was about to collide, violently, with everything she'd left behind. Chapter 4. Grayson Reed arrived at the settlement looking like a man who hadn't slept in weeks because he hadn't. Silver Hollow was dying. Not metaphorically, actually, structurally dying. The Ashford Alliance had collapsed within a month of Lillian's disappearance. Once they realized the trade agreements bore her signature requirement for renewal, and she was nowhere to be found. 2 border skirmishes had turned bloody without her early warning systems active. Half his senior advisors had quietly begun negotiating exit strategies to rival packs, sensing a sinking ship. And Jenna, who he'd risked everything for, had left him the moment it became clear Lillian wasn't coming back to make their affair convenient. Turned out, Jenna had wanted a Luna's crown, not a bankrupt, collapsing pack and a mate who couldn't even keep his own territory together. It had taken Grayson 3 months and an absurd amount of money paid to a very good tracker to find her. He found Lillian outside her cabin, hanging laundry in the crisp mountain air, hair loose around her shoulders, looking more at peace than he'd ever seen her look in 6 years by his side. The sight of her, thriving, radiant, entirely without him, hit him like a physical blow. Lillian, she turned slowly. If she was shocked to see him, she didn't show it. That unnerved him more than anything. Grayson, her voice was even, distant, like greeting a stranger. You look terrible. Silver Hollow is falling apart. He didn't bother with pretense. He was too exhausted for pride. The alliances, the borders, the Lillian, I need you to come back. You threw me away. Her tone didn't rise, didn't crack. In front of your mistress, in your own study. You called 6 years of loyalty not fighting. Grayson flinched, genuinely, like she'd struck him. I was wrong. God, Lillian, I was so wrong. I didn't understand what you actually did for this pack until it all fell apart the second you left. I thought I was the reason we survived. I didn't know it was you, all of it. Every treaty, every warning system, He dragged a hand through his hair, voice cracking. Please, come home, I'll fix this. I'll fix us. For one long moment, watching him unravel in front of her, Lillian felt something old and familiar stir, not love, not anymore, but the ghost of 6 years spent believing her worth was tied to his approval. Then it passed. There is no us, Grayson, she said quietly. There hasn't been an us since before you knew my name meant anything. I'm not the woman who quietly held your pack together in the shadows anymore. And I'm certainly not coming back to be humiliated by a man who only wants me now because I proved I was never replaceable. Lillian, please. The sound of a vehicle approaching cut him off. Cassius Vane's SUV, arriving with 2 additional guards, Adrian himself stepping out despite still favoring his healing ribs. Gold eyes immediately sharpening at the sight of an unfamiliar alpha standing far too close to Lillian. Problem here. Adrian's voice carried the unmistakable, bone-deep authority of a man used to entire rooms going silent when he spoke. Grayson's eyes widened in dawning, horrified recognition. That's Adrian Wolfe. And you are, Adrian's tone was pleasant the way a loaded gun is pleasant. Her mate, Grayson said, too fast, too desperate. Ex-mate, Lillian corrected sharply. Former, as in the past. As in permanently. Before Grayson could respond, before the tension stretched any further, Otto came sprinting down the settlement path, waving his arms with the specific frantic energy that meant something had genuinely gone wrong for once, not raccoon-related. Lily, Cassius said, there's people at the ridge armed, moving fast. They're not settlement folks. Adrian's entire demeanor shifted instantly from irritated to lethal. How many? 6, maybe 8. That's them. Cassius was already moving, barking orders to the 2 guards, positioning near the cabin's perimeter. They tracked us. Sir, we need to get you and the healer to shelter now. Chaos erupted in the space of a heartbeat, guards fanning out. Grayson standing frozen and useless in the middle of it. Adrian pulling Lillian instinctively behind him despite his still healing wound. Every instinct in his body screaming to protect her. But Lillian didn't move behind him. She moved past him. "Lillian, what are you?" "I know these mountains better than anyone here," she said, voice suddenly transformed, sharp, commanding, utterly unrecognizable from the soft-spoken healer either man had known. "I know every choke point on that ridge trail. I know exactly where they'll try to flank from, and I know how to cut off their exit before they realize we've boxed them in." Adrian stared at her. Grayson stared at her. Because in that single moment, the mask Lillian had worn for 6 years at Silver Hollow, quiet, deferential, invisible, fell away completely, revealing the woman who had actually kept an entire pack's defense network running from the shadows. "Who are you?" Adrian breathed, something like awe cutting through his battle focus. Lillian allowed herself, for just a moment, the ghost of a smile. "Someone your enemies should have researched a lot more carefully." And with that, she led the charge up the ridge herself, straight into the fight that would finally reveal exactly how far Lillian Brooks had come, and exactly how much power she truly commanded. Chapter 5. The battle on the ridge lasted less than 20 minutes, but it changed everything. Lillian moved through the terrain like she'd mapped it in her sleep, because she had, every night since arriving, some old instinct refusing to let her settle anywhere without knowing every exit, every vulnerability, every possible threat. She directed Cassius's guards to the choke points with crisp, precise commands, anticipated the attacker's flanking maneuver before it happened, and personally disarmed one assassin with a speed and precision that left even battle-hardened Adrian staring in open disbelief. When the dust settled, 3 attackers were captured, 2 had fled, and one, critically the one who mattered most, was alive and talking under Cassius's very persuasive questioning. The assassin's confession detailed exactly what everyone feared. This hadn't been about Adrian alone. A coalition of rival packs, sensing weakness after Silver Hollow's collapse and Adrian's near death, had begun quietly maneuvering to seize territory across 3 regions simultaneously. Silver Hollow's fall wasn't an isolated tragedy. It was the first domino. "This is bigger than either of us," Adrian said grimly that evening, watching Lillian clean a shallow cut on her arm with the same efficient calm she brought to everything. "If Silver Hollow falls completely, the balance across the entire North collapses with it. Territories I've spent a decade stabilizing will be exposed." Grayson, still shaken, still processing the woman he'd humiliated single-handedly, redirecting an entire ambush, finally found his voice. "Lillian, whatever you need, the pack, the resources, I'll give you anything to fix this." "I'm not doing this for you." Lillian's voice was steady, final. "I'm doing this because thousands of wolves who never chose your mistakes shouldn't have to suffer the consequences of them." Adrian watched her with an expression that had shifted, somewhere in the last 20 minutes, from fascination into something deeper, steadier. "What do you need?" Lillian looked between the 2 alphas. One who had discarded her without ever truly seeing her, one who had seen her clearly within days of meeting her, injured and vulnerable and asking nothing except her name. "I need control," she said finally. "Not a title, not a crown. Operational control of Silver Hollow's restructuring, full authority to rebuild the systems I built the first time, except this time my name is on every single one of them. Publicly, no more shadows." Grayson, to his credit, didn't hesitate. "Done." "And Adrian." Lillian turned to him, something softer entering her voice despite the exhaustion of the day. "I need to know if what's between us is real, or if it's just adrenaline and a shared near-death experience talking." Adrian crossed the space between them without hesitation, ignoring the twinge in his healing ribs, and took her face gently in both hands. "I have run a kingdom of 6 unified packs for 11 years, he said quietly. "I have never once in all that time met someone who made me feel like myself instead of like a crown. That is not adrenaline, Lillian. That is not a near-death experience. That's just you." Otto, watching from a safe distance with Josiah, whispered loudly enough for everyone to hear, "Is this the part where I pretend I'm not crying? Or—" "Otto," Lillian said, laughing despite herself, despite the blood and exhaustion and impossible weight of the day. "Not now." I'm just saying, demon raccoons don't prepare you for this kind of emotional whiplash. The tension broke into genuine, exhausted laughter, the kind that comes after real danger has passed, and everyone realizes all at once that they're still alive to laugh at all. In the weeks that followed, Lillian Brooks did exactly what she'd promised. She returned to Silver Hollow, not as Grayson's mate, not as anyone's quiet shadow, but as the Pack's newly appointed head of strategic operations, her name attached publicly to every system, every alliance, every safeguard she rebuilt from the ground up. Grayson remained alpha in title, humbled and permanently changed, working alongside her with the careful respect of a man who'd learned his lesson at the worst possible cost. And Adrian Wolf, Alpha King of the North, made the 2-day journey to Silver Hollow more often than any of his advisors thought was strategically wise for a man of his position. Not for politics, but for a woman who'd once told him to stop being an idiot about his own stitches, and had never stopped being devastatingly honest with him since. The coalition of rival packs, watching a suddenly unified alliance between Silver Hollow and the Northern Territories forming right in front of them, quietly reconsidered their ambitions. For now, because the war that had been building beneath the surface for months hadn't disappeared, it had simply met its match. And Lillian Brooks, once invisible, once discarded, was no longer standing in anyone's shadow. 6 months later, Lillian stood at the podium during Silver Hollow's Autumn Alliance Summit, her name printed clearly on every document circulated in the room, Adrian seated beside her as an equal partner rather than a distant ally, and Grayson 2 seats down, finally, genuinely respectful of the woman he'd once tried to erase. She thought often of that night in the study, the humiliation that was supposed to break her, the plan designed to make her disappear quietly. Instead, it had forced her to finally step into power she'd been hiding for years out of misplaced loyalty and fear. She wasn't the soft-spoken shadow anymore. She was the architect standing proudly in the light, building something that finally, truly bore her name. Otto still swore the raccoon was watching him. Josiah still rolled his eyes every time. And somewhere in the north, a king who once nearly died in a ravine, counted himself the luckiest wolf alive that a healer with no name had refused to walk past him that stormy night. Thank you so much for watching until the very end. Your support means everything to this channel. If Lillian's journey from invisible to unstoppable moved you, smash that like button, drop a comment telling me your favorite moment, and subscribe so you never miss the next story. See you in the next video, my loves.